Welcome to the Deep Dive. So we've gathered a whole stack of your sources today, articles, research papers, notes, and our mission is really to unpack this whole idea of culinary aphrodisiacs.
Yeah, what actually makes food feel, sensual or get linked to desire?
Exactly. According to this material, we're trying to look maybe beyond just the common beliefs, exploring the biochemistry, sure, but also these really powerful psychological and sensory bits.
Right. It's about seeing what mechanisms might actually be behind these ideas and how things like aroma, texture, flavor, how they could genuinely influence connection. We're digging into how food affects us using this mix of scientific studies, popular articles about romantic cooking, that kind of thing.
Trying to get under the surface of it all. Okay, let's dive in then. First things first, based on these sources, what exactly is an aphrodisiac?
Well, the core definition is pretty straightforward. It's basically a substance that increases feelings of desire.
And the name itself, that goes way back, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It links straight to Aphrodite, the ancient Greek goddess of beauty, fertility, all that. It just shows how long people have connected certain things with, well, desire and making babies.
But the specific word aphrodisiac, that's a bit newer.
Yeah, the sources point that out. The idea is ancient, sure, but the actual word aphrodisiac only popped up in 17th century European texts, English, French, Dutch.
Huh. Why then?
It seems to tie into when European medicine started absorbing ideas and practices from the Middle East. And the meanings shifted a bit over time, too. Pre-modern medicine used it differently than, say, 18th century libertine culture or 19th century pharmacy.
Fascinating. And nowadays, you hear the word and certain foods just jump to mind, right?
Totally. The sources list the usual suspects, the ones with the big reputations. Oysters, asparagus, figs, strawberries, and yeah, chocolate. Always chocolate.
Right. Okay, so we know what they are, the famous examples. But the million-dollar question, does the science actually stack up? What do these sources tell us about the biochemical effects?
Okay, yeah. This is where the sources are pretty much on the same page. The overall scientific view presented is that the research looking for a direct hit, specific foods boosting desire or performance, it's mostly described as lacking and inconclusive.
Lacking, so not much solid proof.
Basically, yeah. Robust scientific evidence is generally lacking. That's the phrase that keeps coming up.
So despite these big reputations, we shouldn't really expect like a guaranteed result just from eating oysters.
That's pretty much what the scientific material implies. Now, that's not to say there's nothing there. The sources do explore potential mechanisms for some foods or the compounds in them. But they always highlight the uncertainty. There's just no definitive proof for a direct aphrodisiac effect from the food itself in isolation.
Okay, let's break down some famous ones then. Oysters, what potential mechanisms are discussed there?
So oysters get mentioned a lot because they're packed with zinc.
Right, zinc.
And the sources explain zinc is genuinely essential for male sexual function, for fertility. If levels are low, that can mess with testosterone and sperm quality.
Okay, so it's important generally.
Very. And interestingly, zinc is also needed to maintain dopamine levels. Dopamine's a key neurotransmitter involved in male sexual health, pleasure, that whole system.
So zinc's vital for reproductive health, sexual health overall, and oysters happen to be a good source.
Exactly. And some research they mentioned suggests that boosting dopamine might increase arousal, maybe even help with certain types of ED symptoms. Oysters also have these antioxidative peptides, which are good for cell health.
But it's more about zinc's basic role, not the oyster being some kind of magic bullet.
Precisely. It's foundational health, not necessarily flicking a desire switch.
Got it. What about chocolate? The ultimate romantic food for many.
Yeah, chocolate's huge.
Yeah.
The sources link it to possible chemical effects on the brain, but again, they say the studies are inconclusive about a direct aphrodisiac thing. Historically, though, the connection's really strong. They mention the Mayans, the Aztecs, the stories about Montezuma drinking loads of cacao before visiting his harem. That belief is ancient.
So the belief's old, but the hard science isn't quite there yet.
That's the gist. The sources point to stuff in chocolate, like caffeine, a stimulant, obviously, and theobromine, that's another natural compound, an antioxidant, might give a subtle mood lift.
And flavonoids.
Yep, flavonoids too. Those plant compounds, especially in dark chocolate, are mentioned for potentially helping blood flow. And good blood flow is, well, pretty relevant for sexual function in general.
And dark chocolate gets the spotlight.
It does. The idea is that dark chocolate, the kind with higher cocoa content, gives you more of those potential flavonoid benefits without all the extra sugar and fat you get in milk chocolate.
Okay. Are there other foods or like compounds where they discuss specific mechanisms, even if the proof is shaky.
Yeah, they touch on a few others. Honey gets mentioned as a traditional natural aphrodisiac, and they note it has some protective roles in reproductive health. Things like cola plants and Garcinia cola nuts.
Never heard of that one.
Right. They're discussed because they have antioxidant compounds and natural stimulants, caffeine, theobromine again. Some studies showed these might inhibit enzymes linked to erectile dysfunction.
Ah, so looking at ED pathways seems common in this kind of research.
It does pop up. Several herbal compounds are mentioned in that context. Ginseng, for instance. It's suggested it might boost nitric oxide production.
Nitric oxide.
Yeah.
That helps relax blood vessels, right? Increase blood flow.
Exactly. Super important for, well, penile tissue function. Some human studies showed ginseng improved erectile function, but the sources are careful to mention limitations, different study methods, different groups of people, potential mild side effects, too. It's not clear-cut.
Nitric oxide. That's part of the whole erection process, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Part of a chemical chain involving things like cGMP that relaxes smooth muscle, increases blood flow, and interestingly, horny goot weed.
Can't ignore that name.
Right. It contains icariin, and the sources mention it acts like a PDE5 inhibitor. That's actually the same mechanism used by many prescription ED drugs. They target that specific pathway.
Wow. So traditional remedies potentially hitting the same biological targets.
Seems possible. Another one is deep palm pollen, traditionally used for male infertility. Studies suggest it can improve sperm quality, count, motility, maybe due to some natural estrogen-like compounds and flavonoids it contains.
Okay.
Then there's maca, also traditional for aphrodisiac and fertility uses. Animal studies suggest a lipid extract boosted sexual function. Even clove gets a mention. Reported as an aphrodisiac traditionally, and some extracts apparently increase sexual activity in male rats.
Okay, so we're seeing these potential biochemical links, often tied to general health stuff like zinc or the specific blood flow pathways needed for physical function. But the big picture for these foods, directly sparking desire. Still pretty fuzzy scientifically.
That's the crucial thing the sources keep emphasizing. The direct cause and effect biochemical proof for most of these traditional aphrodisiac foods, it's weak or inconclusive. Which brings us to something else. The sources stress. Something incredibly powerful.
Let me guess. The placebo effect.
Bingo. The power of belief.
Ah.
This might honestly be the biggest factor the sources point to for explaining why people feel like these foods work. Just believing that a food might boost desire can be incredibly potent.
Power of suggestion.
Totally. If you serve something or eat something expecting it to be an aphrodisiac, that belief itself can change how you perceive things, maybe even trigger some physiological responses, whether the food itself is doing anything specific chemically or not.
So if you think oysters going to get you in the mood, that thought alone might actually get you in the mood.
It very well could. The mind-body connection is remarkably strong. And this actually leads us nicely away from just chemistry and belief into the other really profound ways food connects with us, especially in intimate settings.
Which is the whole sensory experience.
Exactly. If the direct biochemical effects are up in the air, the way food engages our senses, that's undeniably powerful. It's central to creating connection, influencing feelings.
Okay, let's start with smell. How important is aroma?
Hugely important. Aroma is highlighted as having this incredibly strong link to our emotions, even sexual motivation. Our sense of smell, the olfactory system, it's kind of unique because it has this direct line to parts of the brain dealing with emotion and motivation, the limbic system, the hypothalamus.
So smelling something good is like a shortcut to feeling good.
In a way, yes. And the sources even mention how body odors can subtly influence attraction, who we choose as a partner, maybe even signal fertility. It shows how fundamental smell is to connection. And food aromas obviously trigger powerful emotional responses too, memories, comfort, warmth.
Any specific smells called out in the sources?
They mention cinnamon. That warm, spicy scent is linked to comfort, alertness, focus, and maybe even a mild potential aphrodisiac effect, probably more through mood enhancement than anything else. And vanilla. That sweet, comforting smell is linked to positive mood, feeling balanced, less sad or irritable, maybe even a little serotonin boost, you know, the feel-good chemical.
So even if the food lacks a magic ingredient, just the smell alone can set a positive mood, influence how we feel.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize that scent is critical for whether we accept and enjoy food and for triggering those emotional responses that are so key for setting a romantic vibe.
What about texture? That's one we maybe don't think about as much, but it's huge in how we experience food.
Oh, texture is described as critical, even if it's often unconscious. It affects how we perceive flavor, how aroma gets released, even how full we feel. The sources talk about how people have these strong, sometimes subconscious preferences for how food feels in their mouth. They even categorize people into mouth behavior groups, like, are you a sucker, a cruncher, a chewer, a smoosher?
Seriously, mouth behavior groups.
Apparently. And these preferences really influence if you like or dislike a food, often based on how easy it is to manage in your mouth.
So serving a meal with textures your partner actually enjoys could make a big difference to the whole experience.
Definitely. And texture expectations matter too. If something feels weirdly different than you expect, it can be really off-putting. The sources even note that millennials seem to prioritize texture quite a bit. And chefs, of course, craft texture carefully with ingredients and cooking methods.
And flavor, naturally, is that mix of taste and aroma.
Exactly. They work together. One influences the other. The sources mention things like the Maillard reaction, that browning reaction when you cook food with heat.
Searing a steak, yeah.
Right. It creates those deep, savory flavors, that nice color, changes the texture. It adds so much to the sensory experience, including the smell.
So creating a meal that smells amazing, feels good texturally, tastes delicious. That seems key. What about how it looks on the plate?
Visuals count too, for sure. The sources note that how you plate food can actually foster fondness, and this idea of making a meal feel luxurious, treating it like a restaurant dish that comes up when discussing romantic meals, maybe less detail than aroma or texture, but presentation clearly adds to that feeling of specialness.
Okay, so we've got potential, uncertain biochemistry, the massive placebo effect, and the huge impact of the senses smell, texture, flavor, sight. What about the deeper psychological stuff, the social side?
That's another really big theme in these sources, especially how food links to mood and connection. Think about comfort foods. They're strongly tied to the brain's reward system, right? Dopamine release, pleasure, satisfaction.
Explains why we crave mac and cheese when we're stressed.
Exactly. Emotional eating, especially high-fat, high-sugar stuff, hits those reward centers. But the sources go even deeper, talking about the gut-brain axis.
Gut talking to the brain, you mean?
Yeah, essentially. Those trillions of microbes in your gut, they're constantly communicating with your brain, and it massively influences your emotions, your mental health.
Yeah.
And your diet directly shapes that gut microbiome. Eating lots of fiber, good plant compounds like polyphenols, healthy fats that tends to support a healthier gut community, which in turn seems to help with emotion regulation. Whereas diets high in refined sugar and unhealthy fats, not so good for the gut, or potentially for mood.
So feeling good overall, partly thanks to your gut, makes you more likely to feel intimate.
It certainly helps create the right internal environment, doesn't it? And then there's the fundamental social part, cooking for someone. The sources describe it as this profoundly social act. It's about care, building trust, nurturing the relationship, feeling like you belong together.
There really is something special about making food for someone you care about.
There is. And the sources state it pretty clearly. Sharing meals is strongly linked to feeling better overall. More positive feelings, fewer negative ones. They stress that the context, who you eat with, where you eat, massively impacts your mood. Even memories tied to shared foods play a role.
So the social setting, the act of sharing, is maybe just as important as what's actually on the plate.
Potentially even more so for mood and connection in that moment. That's what the sources suggest.
Wow. Okay, putting this all together then, it's obviously way more complicated than just one magic ingredient.
Absolutely. The sources paint this really nuanced picture. Yes, the hard science for specific aphrodisiac foods having direct, powerful effects, it's limited beyond maybe nutrients like zinc or compounds affecting general health pathways.
Right.
But the whole experience of food in a romantic context, that's incredibly powerful.
And that power comes from all these different layers interacting.
Exactly. You've got maybe subtle biochemical stuff, sure. But layered on top is the huge power of belief, the placebo effect, then the massive impact of the senses. The smell, the texture, the taste, how it looks. Combine that with the deep psychological links to mood, reward, memory.
And finally, that really fundamental social bonding, the emotional connection that comes from deliberately cooking for someone and sharing that meal together.
That's the full picture these sources seem to give us. The dishes people list as sexy or romantic, salmon, scallops, shrimp, pasta, roasted veggies, nice salads, lamb. They aren't necessarily proven biochemical wonders in themselves, but they're probably chosen for these occasions because they naturally hit all those notes. Sensory pleasure, psychological comfort, social connection.
And maybe they aren't super stressful or messy to make either. Leaves you relaxed.
That even gets a mention. There are funny comments in the sources about simple dishes feeling luxurious, or that very practical, slightly alarming advice. Never fry bacon naked.
Okay, noted. Good safety tip.
It just shows that the ease and enjoyment of the whole process feeds into the positive experience, too.
This has been really fascinating. So if you had to boil it down, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the sources?
I think it's that while the hard scientific proof for specific aphrodisiac foods is often shaky, the sources show us something much richer. How food impacts us goes way beyond just simple chemistry. It works through subtle biology, yes, but maybe even more profoundly through our senses, our psychology, and our social bonds. The real culinary aphrodisiac seems to be less about one magic ingredient.
And more about?
More about the intention, the shared sensory enjoyment, and that connection you build together around the table.
That's a really powerful way to reframe it. It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Considering everything zinc and dopamine, the power of smell, the emotional weight of sharing food, maybe the true culinary aphrodisiac isn't really a thing you eat, but rather that whole sensory, psychological, social experience you consciously create and share.
That feels like the big question these sources pose. It definitely encourages a much broader view of how food nourishes us, not just our bodies, but our moods, our senses, and importantly, our relationships.
Absolutely. Something for all of you to think about. Maybe explore the sources or just reflect on your own experiences where food, senses, mood, and connection all came together. Thanks for diving deep with us today.